Thanks, PT. With me now is R3 partner Greg Paul, Charles de Brabant, CEO at St. Pierre Brabant Lee & Associates, and Jean Lin, Isobar's CEO, Asia Pacific. John Gershma says virtues like thrift are back in fashion in the West. Are the Chinese following these trends? I mean, what virtues appeal to Chinese consumers?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of diversification now, but still Chinese are very, very status driven. You look at the luxury brands here, they didn't really have a downturn the way it was in the West. So you're still seeing a lot of growth in the luxury sector here, and you're going to see that for some time to come.
Right, but here social media has also recently taken a huge increase in terms of its popularity and use by brands. So Jean, in terms of social media, it allows brands to reach a lot more consumers, but also makes it more difficult for them to control and to protect their brand equity. So how do companies use social media in a way that helps them grow the brand, but also protect its integrity?
I think one key thing that marketers need to realize today is that you really cannot control the consumer. What you can do is to respect them and embrace what you need to do best, that is delivering your product and offering. So once you actually have that principle, you don't need to control what the consumer think, but to participate in the conversation to ensure that they know you and your brand better. I think that's the most important principle in terms of doing social marketing.
And Charles, in luxury, I mean, this
well,
is your area.
In luxury, it's a little bit complicated because you want to keep the aspirationality of your brand. So if you're Chanel, you want to, in my view, you want to control because you want to keep that aspirational part of the brand, which is a little bit complicated.
How do you control it?
Well, one of the things that Chanel does extremely well in the digital world is it actually, once you click onto Chanel anywhere in the web, it brings you back to Chanel News, which is an environment that they completely control. So that's one brand, and I think Chanel, because of its positioning, needs to do that. But a brand like Burberry, which is a more democratic brand, but I wouldn't say that in a derogatory way, but just because of the way that Christopher Bailey, the creative director, talks to people and the brand positioning allows them to have a much more fluid two-way communication with consumers and engage the consumer. And I think that today in the luxury world, even the same consumer, sometimes they want to aspire, sometimes they want to talk. So there's place for brands to do both things. But if I were Chanel, I wouldn't start interacting two-way all the time with consumers because that's not what consumers are looking for from a brand like Chanel.
Right, and that makes sense if you're controlling your own corporate communications and things like that. But within China, I mean, if you look at the advent of platforms like Weibo, how do luxury brands control those sort of channels of communication?
You don't necessarily control them, but you monitor them. For instance, L'Oreal did a lot of monitoring after the SK2 crisis, they started it because of crisis management. So they wanted to monitor words and see if there was a crisis emerging. But they then realized that it was a phenomenal tool to understand what was happening on the web and what consumers were saying, which is one of the reasons I think that within the L'Oreal group, Lancôme is the #1 digital brand on the web today because they used all that information extremely intelligently to create a community of people. And Lancôme can interact like this because it has an emotional platform that allows it as a brand to communicate that way.
Right, so you're saying in some ways to preserve for some, perhaps at the highest end of the luxury spectrum, some of those brands actually need to maintain a bit of that mysticism and a bit of that distance to preserve the aspirational aspect perhaps.
Which is a big challenge given what we know today and the fact that you can't control the net citizens out there.
Right.
But I think brands have to be careful. They can't betray who they are and what consumers are expecting out of them.
But you talk about Weibo, we've just done some interesting research to show that 3 of the top 4 brands that we've seen in terms of consumer engagement are the sports brands, Nike, Adidas, and Li Ning. So they're already very high engagement brands, they're in a very high engagement category, and they're already using social media in a very compelling way. So it's going to be interesting to see what we can learn from them that you can take to some of the other brands in China.
It's interesting that you've got Li Ning in there now with the big boys like Nike, and actually that dovetails very well into the next issue that I'm very concerned about, which is what Chinese brands do you think have the greatest chance of playing on the global stage?
Well, Li Ning will be one of them. I think it's changed a lot in the last 5 years. There's been more changes in the last 5 years than probably the previous 20 years for Chinese brands. They've attracted great talent from P&G and Coca-Cola and other companies. They're really raising their game quite a lot. Li Ning, Lenovo, Yili, some of these companies are now very much looking outward, much more than ever before.
Do you think any of these brands within China in the luxury area will ever be able to create a global luxury brand?
Well, I think the issue is a general issue. If in China, most people go for volume. And I think to be a respected brand, you have to go beyond that. You have to bring quality, you have to bring emotion, you have to bring connection. And I think that that's where even Li-Ning has a lot of work to do compared to its other competitors. Because as soon as it doesn't get into a volume game or a price game, Li-Ning suffers. So I think, and that's going to be the same thing in luxury. You know, luxury takes time. So you got to give it time. You've got to work on the quality and not just the quantity. And once a brand understands that, be it Chinese, Brazilian, Indian, I don't think the world is open to them because they've got a different story to tell on the world stage or within China. So I think, and especially today with the proudness of Chinese.
Can you think of any examples of Chinese brands who have done a good job creating a luxury image?
I think since brand building is relatively new thing in China compared to the West, I think a lot of brand development is still in this space trying to figure out a way to have the real brand equity build up that suits Chinese people. So a short answer to this is I've not yet seen a successful luxury Chinese brand in the market. I don't know what the gentlemen think about
you
it.
know, I think one of the interesting things you'll see is, LVMH has recently bought a couple of Baijiu brands, right, and tried to reinvent the Chinese wine brands. So you may see that where foreign brands come in to try and reinvigorate in that sector. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, you've also got Hermes with Shangxia. I think if you look at where the Asians are very strong in brand building, it's more in the hospitality, hotel, airline industries. You know, if you look at the Mandarin Group, Cathay Pacific,
Sure.
Banyan Tree,
Shangri-La.
Shangri-La, I think you probably start to see people in that space because it seems to be, the world is so brutal to a certain extent on daily life in these big cities, Asian cities, because they don't really exist anywhere else except in Latin America, that you need to find soothing moments elsewhere, and I think that that's where Asian brands have excelled, and probably that might be a space where you'll see people, and you think of a brand, I don't know what people would consider a luxury brand, but Din Tai Fung as a restaurant brand is extremely impressive in the quality of service that it delivers. And I mean,
Yeah,
it's become quite global too. It's in North America.
Although I wouldn't say it's a Chinese brand, it's a Taiwanese brand, and that's
that
different
becomes the
brand.
whole debate. Whole debate.
That's a brand development space that we have to be careful about.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, because Charles also mentioned earlier about provenance, and we've obviously seen Italy, France, Germany. Each of these has a lot of equity within the country of origin. I mean, does China's other parties play a role? Whether it's government or whether it's larger institutions and organizations in building up the equity in the Made in China label, aside from just companies, because companies can only do so much on an individual level.
Well, last year was the first time that the government actually invested in a Made in China campaign, which ran in the United States. So you're starting to see those sort of things happening. I think it's a pretty early trend. From a tourism perspective now, you've got the provinces investing in tourism advertising for the first time. So you're starting to see the government getting more involved in that.
You also see it, teaching at CIBS luxury branding course, you sort of see it in the students too. There's a lot more pride. So I think consumers or just Chinese people in general have a lot more pride in what China's doing. So I think this is a great moment to start doing things. And I don't think it's by accident that you're getting all these brands that are starting to emerge, whether they're Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, mainland Chinese, but a lot of them are starting to stir the pot, and the pot is stirring.
Right.
But you don't build a luxury brand overnight.
No, that's a long process.
And I think then you get into debates
You can break
about
one.
you look at SK2. It was broken in 6 months' time. It went down to 20% of its sales after.
And I think one interesting thing that people are talking about is Chinese people will start to buy Western brands that they perceive as that fits into a brand space for China. So that's another way of looking at whether it's an origin from China, or it's a brand that Chinese enterprise start to control more and more in getting into the space. So that's another way of looking at it.
And so talking about consumers and the control of the relationship between consumers and brands, obviously in the West for quite a while already, consumers have been quite used to driving the conversation and really sometimes driving the interaction more so than here. But I mean, here we can see a tide shift as well. Have you seen examples where consumers are actually taking charge of the relationship between themselves and brands?
Well, I think, Consumer Day, which is every year at the same time, is a very intense day for most companies because on that day there are 3 or 4 brands announced that consumers have voted as being not of a high enough quality. HP last year lost a lot of market share just purely based on Consumer Day. So, consumers do have a voice in certain areas in China.
And I think because of the rise of Chinese Weibo, it's actually a good channel for Chinese people actually to voice out what they think of a brand and how they feel. So that's something that the listening and monitoring of social media actually come into play. The way that a brand embrace consumer may not necessarily be interacting with them, energetically, but in a way is to embrace and listening to what they have to say and make sure that we deliver the service in the right way.
Yeah, there's now 191 million Chinese social media users. It's more than the entire internet population of the United States. So, and that's only going to continue to grow.
Which means the monitoring is not so easy because that's where they're expressing themselves. So you got to build up relatively sophisticated ways to monitor because that's where it's happening. You probably won't see it as much in other avenues like newspapers or so makes it interesting and to the carrot and stick routine. I think everybody uses the carrot and everybody uses the stick. So in their interactions with brands.
And so, Jean, when you talked about brands actually changing themselves and adapting themselves to China, have you guys seen some good examples where brands that perhaps were previously a bit traditional or a bit stodgy have reinvented themselves or reinvigorated themselves in China? Can you give us some real examples?
I think there are actually a lot of brands that are doing it. And I can think of like 2 examples. One is a brand like KFC, which is dominating the fast food chain in China, that they actually quite actively listening to the conversation on Weibo regarding their product, their new services, and consumers' reaction to their sales promotions. And that you have seen actions being taken for the way that adjust their sales promotion in the stores. And the other thing that's quite interesting last year is the sale of the smart car on Taobao. So basically, it's a social program that use one button on Weibo to start the entire selling proposition. Have a group on Taobao and sold 205 cars in only 3.5 hours. So that's an amazing example of how social actually becomes social commerce. I think that's a key thing that's going to happen in this convergent world here in China, combining commerce and social together.
How was Xenia able to build that connection with its customers?
Well, I think that Xenia does things differently than many other brands. I think a lot of companies today in China, irrespective of whether they're in luxury or other industries, are there to take as much as they can from consumers. What Xenia did is they built a business model where they gave in order to then make money, to make the Chinese man look better and better and better, to advise them, to commit to China. It's not an easy name to pronounce if you want to pronounce the whole name. I can't even pronounce it, although I've lived in Europe for a long time. But still, they've been able to create that connection, that confidence, that trust that allows them to have their loyal customers come back and back and back again to get the right kind of advice to make them better and better and better looking.
And do you think a lot of luxury brands here, aside from their product and relying on the brand image of the product, do you think a lot of luxury brands in China have done a good job of actually educating their staff so that at the service level, they're actually living the brand values?
Clearly, Xenia does that extremely well. I was going back, I don't know whether we position this as a luxury brand, but you think of Din Tai Fung. What a smile will do to create a relationship and a lasting impression when you leave. I still remember one of the waitresses there just smiling at me, and that just, it doesn't cost anything,
right,
but it builds an amazing amount of loyalty. And luxury brands, often you go into a store, no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are, they have a great way of making you feel extremely bad. So the brands that make you feel good, and that's why I think Xenia does it well, Din Tai Fung does it well, you just want to go back and back and back and back. I go back to the brutality of the daily life here. You just want to be pampered. Mm-hmm. And the brands that can pamper you, and I don't know KFC very well, but they probably do not a bad job even at that, at their level.
Sure. Make you feel special for interacting with their brand and being a loyal customer.
Exactly.
Well, great. Greg, Charles, Jean, thanks a lot for joining us on Thoughtful China. That wraps it up for today. Please subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube, and you can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter.